Jaleen Grove is a Canadian artist and art historian whose area of focus is the history of illustration in the US and Canada. She teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design, and she's also held research and teaching positions at Ringling College of Art and Design and Washington University. She's associate editor of the magnificent 592-page History of Illustration published by Bloomsbury in 2018. Welcome, Jaleen, to the Bibliophile.
Hi, Nigel. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Now, you call that book The Monster, right?
Yes, I'm afraid it got nicknamed the Monster Book about a third of the way into it, yes.
It's just packed with all sorts of wonderful illustrations of illustrations.
That's a good way to put it, and something I keep reminding my students about. They're not allowed to write from pictures of pictures. They have to go actually find the picture in its original form.
In the book, you contribute a survey chapter, a chapter on Avant Garde Illustration from 1900 to 1950, in which you survey a variety of different movements that go to make up the quote Avant Garde. You start off with some words on the emergence of modernism. What's the difference between modernism and the avant garde? Or is there one?
Well, modernism, modernity is kind of the whole social system-wide changes that happen globally in the period under discussion, which is loosely, we could say late 19th century to 3/4 into the 20th century. Within that, modernism tends to refer to the modern art movements, among which, of course, the avant-garde is considered the most indicative. So there's an awful lot of crossover, and some people may want to point to finer points of difference between modernism and the avant-garde. For our purposes and the fact that this is an undergraduate textbook, we can pretty much merge them.
Okay. Yeah, there are so many movements. There's all sorts of attention that's being paid to this period, and various academics, I suppose, want to kind of carve out their own little part of it. Is that what's going on here with all these movements?
The movements were named very much by the people doing them a lot of the time. Some of them, they gave themselves the names themselves. In other cases, they were given the names, sometimes by journalists or other onlookers, but these names of all the isms, Cubism, Futurism, Expressionism, etc., turned up while the things were coming into existence. They're not dubbed later.
Okay, so they do have that sort of sense of immediacy or legitimacy.
Yeah, they are how these movements have always been known. So they're the terms that we use today.
Why was it so important to come out with a name for what they were all doing? They wanted to, what do they want to do with that?
I think because artists were tending to work in collectives and understood the advantage of working in a collective, that they could kind of stake a claim and say that, I'm not making this crazy art because I'm just me in my lonely studio. If you could identify with a movement that gave you gravitas and importance and a purpose, and quite frankly, branding that the public could get their minds around. So it was sort of a protective mechanism, you could say, and a way to push ahead an agenda. And if there's one thing that all these avant-garde or modernist movements have, it's that they had agenda.
They had all sorts of manifestos, didn't they?
Many wrote manifestos, some didn't bother, but they definitely all were brought together in their small collectives, which then became bigger collectives, by certain philosophies, concerns about society or how to be a human being that were in common.
I see, okay. You start off this piece, The Emergence of Modernism, with the 19th and early 20th centuries brought a reordering of priorities and the questioning of and alteration of traditional social hierarchies, gender roles, presumptions of God and spirituality, and the conduct of daily life. So how did they want to change the conduct of daily life?
Well, I think for some people, they were influenced by the writings of Marx and other people who were agitating for social reform. And if daily life meant going to a factory and being alienated, exploited labor, they definitely wanted to disrupt that.
For sure. Yeah, if you're a factory worker, yeah, but they're not, the factory workers weren't the artists, though.
Yes, well, they appointed themselves the spokesperson of the oppressed.
Okay. You say then, with the diminishing of traditions came also questioning of what was true and real, and hence how to represent reality. So how was reality represented at the time?
I think the conventional answer would have been, when we're talking about art, people would look to academic training and many of the techniques that were brought in during the Italian Renaissance. So for instance, it was taken for granted that you would represent, the dimensional world in terms of geometric perspective. And that was taught mathematically. So it was absolutely correct according to mathematical principles, which, the invention of the camera conveniently replicated to a certain degree. And so that was kind of considered the progressive, or the epitome of how to represent space in a two-dimensional plane. And of course, that's completely tossed out with Cubism and a few other, modernist thoughts that were happening at the time. But Cubism is probably the most famous example. So get rid of that perspective stuff. It's a lie. It's not even taking into account a binocular vision. We need to be able to see optical reality, meaning what we can observe with our own eyeballs, in a more relative sense, in a more subjective sense. And so the whole point of Cubism, or one of the points, was to be able to try and record the actual experience of being able to understand something from multiple points of view in one frame.
Yeah, sort of try to make the two-dimensional three-dimensional.
Yet still on a two-dimensional surface, yeah. And without resorting to the trick of 1 point or 2 point or 3 point perspective.
Yeah, because there was perspective, there was depth in the existing canon of painting, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to, is just using all the tricks of mathematical perspective to imply a space that wasn't there in kind of a trompe-l'oeil sense.
Yeah.
That was seen as a falsehood, as a lie by proponents of Cubism.
And prior to Cubists, there was the realists that decided that they wanted to show the brutal truth of life rather than beautiful ideals.
Yeah, so here we need, for people who are not trained in art history, just to distinguish a little bit the word realism in this context. People refer to photographic appearances on a canvas as being realistic or realism. An art historian would prefer to say that's naturalism. So in an art history sense, when we say realism, we're pointing to a gritty reality, not putting a sort of polite facade or veneer on things. So it's about choice of subject matter. It's often tied to the word social realism, but not all realists were socialists.
Well, like Courbet liked to paint ordinary people. That was quite a shock at the time.
It wasn't. This is one of these myths that sort of warped through the way art history has been told. People were used to seeing the subject matter all the time in the newspaper, specifically the illustrated press. We saw depictions of gritty reality and so forth all the time in the news. What Courbet did was he took that subject matter, that documentary journalistic lens, and he blew it up into the language of academic salon painting, as Manet did with Olympia. He's basically using a documentary journalistic approach to document a sex worker, but he does it on a grand scale in oil paint and tries to show it as art, quote unquote, rather than an illustration. Not that it would have been terribly acceptable as an illustration of being a nude, but in both cases, this is why it ruffles feathers, is because they're mixing categories. And academic art at the time, polite art, salon art, was conventionally assumed to celebrate the beautiful and to provide exemplars of life that would inspire people's best moral selves. Holding up gritty reality, unflattering reality in the I guess the realms of art or the framing of art was just a challenge to art itself, not just public morals.
It seems to me this all presages the kind of catastrophe that takes place during the First World War, where everything is blown up, and this idea of having faith in human goodness, is shattered. But a lot of this is coming before that, though, isn't it? The way that they sort of blow up painting and all of the different ways that tradition said what it should be.
Sure. I mean, the war doesn't come out of nowhere. I mean, there was simmering feelings in society before the war, and all the events of the First World War are kind of a match to tinder, as it were. And the tinder was already being pointed to or shown that it existed by the more radical artists who were interested in bringing to people's awareness that things were not all sweet, good, and happy for everybody in society. German Expressionism was already well underway before the First World War. Yeah,
okay. You talk about social changes that this movement called for, but what actually happened?
Which movement in particular?
Well, but whether actual social change occurred, as opposed to just borrowing and commodification of fashionable avant-garde looks, is a matter for debate.
Okay, so broadly sweeping, modernism, or the avant-garde, does end up getting co-opted into advertising. And so that's sort of the big question, right? Does it just become new fancy commodities? And pretty strong arguments that it does. There's still, of course, radical thought and so on that continues, and people keep bucking the system long after this period ends, and with reference to it. So it does continue its radical efforts and fringe right up to the present day. But hey, I mean, it became fashionable, like it or not. You read through any magazines in the 20s and 30s, you'll see a lot of hype about the modernistic, as opposed to modernism, which was a word that you see applied to interior decoration and clothing and cars and
yes,
yeah.
So really, it takes the edge off it, it sort of takes all the glitz and the appearance, while embodying exactly what it is that these movements wanted to get rid of.
Yeah, exactly. Very ironic. Comes full circle. And shorn of its political urgency, it just becomes a design statement.
Right. A statement about what?
Well, that was the question, wasn't it? It was purportedly to show how with it and progressive and embracing of the 20th century you were. But what was that? Going shopping?
Yes. Looking cool?
Yes.
Okay, the first, it's not exactly a movement, but the first sort of topic that you deal with specifically is livre d'artiste.
Mm-hmm.
Here you say no longer was illustration just to decorate a book or show what the text described. Illustration was now to stimulate thought.
Right. So this is actually a discourse that begins in the 19th century, and a bit of a reaction to the explosion of commercial print media that happened with the advances in letterpress and lithography and other print techniques that were happening that helped fuel the rise of the commercial industrial mass media. This is a kind of a knee-jerk reaction because some people were very disturbed by this flood of pictorial news and so on. Mallarmé, as stands as a major figure in arguing for something else. And famously, he said he was for no illustration. Now, that was a bit of rhetoric on his part because he went on to produce all kinds of illustrative books, but illustration had changed its form and its purpose under his guidance and influence. So he's an avant-garde poet. Like many writers throughout the 19th century, he was kind of threatened by illustration because pictures tend to be more popular than words. Dickens against this as well. It used to be at the beginning of this sort of explosion in commercial press that very often the publisher would get a hold of some really nice looking illustrations or commission someone to make a batch and then hire some writer to compose a story around them.
Right.
So
Pass backwards, kind of.
Well, no, that was the correct way back then. If you were a publisher, you knew that pictures sold stuff better than the stories did.
Right. From their perspective, but from the perspective of a writer, it's not.
Yeah. So to reach into our Bourdieu and battles in the field of cultural production, this was really an upstart writers' movement to reclaim power, to reassert the dominance of the word, which of course there's great literary and ethical tradition because we're a logocentric society in the West. It's the word of God, not the image of God. And
don't do the image.
Right. We've been an iconoclastic society for some time. And so Mallarmé could successfully argue that pictures were the devil, but not all pictures. And so this is where this fairly famous book that he produces, illustrated by Manet, it's an edition of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, becomes quite seminal because it's often hailed as the first real livre d'artiste or painter's book, using the looseness that lithography loaned itself to, where you could preserve the autographic hand of the artist as opposed to relying on an engraver to translate your image into something suitable for letterpress. So it is more painterly technology. And so Manet does his painterly illustrations and very loose, kind of almost abstract, you could say, approach, especially for the sensibilities of the 1870s, to accompany Poe's very dark poem, The Raven, which is about a man grieving for his lost lover. This is the kind of thing that Mallarmé's interested in, where the image and the text kind of sit side by side with less of a connection than illustration typically had with the text. So the artist is allowed a bunch of self-expression and perhaps some deviation from the text even, in order to make parallel art forms that then inform each other, partly through the connections that the reader is then asked to make. So it empowers the reader. It's meant to empower the reader.
Yeah, this is mixed up, though, because I think writers may have been concerned about publishers putting illustrations into their work because they want the reader's imagination to be triggered by their words, not by illustration.
Yes, but as you see, writers also wanted their works to sell. And you're far more likely to sell a book with illustrations than without.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Yes, you say here that the raven's shadow is nearly abstract, allowing the viewer to read it into it as he or she would the poem. A key aspect of avant-garde illustration, which was intended to empower and challenge the reader to think rather than simply be amused.
That was the key difference that avant-garde book producers were going for.
That's interesting. You reference a controversy. The bibliophiles drew a sharp distinction between mass-produced illustrated books and livres d'artistes, eschewing commercial styles, especially Art Nouveau, which in posters and advertising was crowding public space and looking dated by 1905. Unimaginative portrayal of the text, ostentation, or attempts to fake watercolor or oil painting with printmaking techniques in what soon became a major point of contention. Purist bibliophiles demanded that the illustration be subordinate to the overall layout and typography, while Vallard and others protested that the artist should be allowed complete freedom to break the rules.
Yeah, I'm pointing here to very much national cultures. French livre d'artiste was interested in allowing the artist quite a bit of control and a disruption of what a book conventionally was or wasn't. Remember, this is at the time when William Morris is holding sway, not just in England, but internationally, and his ideas of the unity of the book, basing it on Ruskin's principles of architecture being the chief of the arts, is popular. It's really defining the backbone of the Book Beautiful movement, but it's heavily typographic. And in typography, you're dealing with very much a grid, just the nature of typesetting on the letterpress. And so within that tradition, woodcuts originally, and then wood engravings in the 19th century, conveniently, most conveniently, were made into squares and rectangles and so on that fit the column of type or the facing page or what have you, but fit very much into that extremely traditional book design, which is actually descended from manuscript tradition. So there was also a lot of talk in more circles about the importance of the weight of the text, the look of the text being matched in sensibility by the line of the illustration. So they're looking back to Durer as their exemplar, among others, or Hans Holbein. So in the British sensibility, bibliophile sensibility, that is where they saw quality in books, was this kind of deference to that tradition and a continuation of it, albeit modernized, as we see in an Eric Gill image that's also in this book that we're looking at. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, I'm not sure that we've entirely introduced. So the book we're looking at is History of Illustration 2018. I should probably just talk a little bit about the full context for this. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. I do believe I did mention the name of the book.
Yeah, but not its purpose. not
its purpose. Okay, let's do that.
I'll keep it short, but I did mention this is a textbook for undergraduates. So it's been a long time since there was an attempt at a comprehensive overview of the history of illustration. There have been some notable books along the way, but nothing really since the 1970s, and nothing really since the 1950s, actually. Okay. So as a result, among other things, illustrations had this kind of second-class status in the arts. And I mean, graphic design got its history of graphic design with Megs in the 80s. Yeah. And so this was largely kind of looking to that kind of book to try and give students sort of an overview and a foundation from which to build advanced work. But everyone teaching it was tearing their hair out because the literature on history of illustration is actually very difficult to find if you're just, an undergraduate adjunct professor trying to cobble together a course last minute and not getting paid for that work. So this was the statement of, hey, our field exists, it is distinct from the history of art and distinct from the history of design, of which it's often erroneously plunked into. So this was very much a milestone, you could say, for the field of illustration. So it was also, for better or worse, put together on a very collaborative basis. So there were 3 co-editors, of which I was one. And then there were individual chapter writers. And because of issues of budget, as in none, everybody volunteered their time. Nobody was paid for that. Oh, goodness. And we will never make up the costs that we had, both material and time-wise, in what it took to put it together. So it was extremely a labor of love. Yeah. Because of its kind of somewhat ad hoc, collaborative, and I have to say rushed process, even though it took us 6 years, there are gaps because we were reliant on whoever was available to step up and do something. That's why you may find like, hey, what about this? Why isn't that mentioned? It's like, yeah, we thought about that, but we just couldn't. The other problem with print books, of course, is that you're not allowed to go on and on and on. They cut it off at some point, and this publisher decided to cut it off at 600 pages. So, well,
it's marvelously comprehensive, if you ask me, but yeah, you can only do so much.
Well, and also we had a mandate to try and cover global and from caveman to virtual reality.
Yeah, that's a major mandate. That's a multi-volume set there. That's what that is.
Yeah, and maybe in the future it will get split off into the volumes that could, address their subjects in more depth. But there's over 900 images, and that alone was incredibly difficult to pull together if you know anything about tracing copyrights, especially for illustration where stuff is orphaned and sold off, and God knows who has the copyright. That alone took a year. Yeah.
Well, thank you for adding that. That's I guess I was supposed to do that at the beginning of the interview, or should it? But you know what? It's often good to jump into something and then go back. So that's what we've done here. Mm-hmm. An epic. Before we get along with some of the other movements, what impact did all of this have on books? Is that too big a question?
The introduction of the avant garde and the livre d'artiste, you mean?
Generally, I guess we started to see the types of fragmented montage, photo montage, that kind of collage.
Yeah, the influences are huge. I mean, William Morris's message, which was basically take book design seriously, if I'm to dumb it down to just one big message, that's it,
Yeah.
really took off. And I think everywhere where they heard of William Morris, they started taking books more seriously and paying attention to the nuances of space and typesetting and everything.
Impact on the reader.
Yeah, but there was also a self-awareness among people who now thought of themselves as book designers as opposed to jobbing printers. So out of that, the field of graphic design starts to emerge. The experimentations going on with modern art and coming out in books, but also, of course, paintings and sculptures and so on, absolutely changes what is possible for anyone in the visual arts. Suddenly, you did not have to obey the rules of academic art. There was an entirely different, it was like a door opening up to another universe. The impact of this cannot be underestimated. Illustrators suddenly had probably 5 times as many ways of thinking about how to create an image than they did before.
It's not that the books necessarily changed dramatically, though. I mean, you still read a line of text, right?
Oh, yes, but you're not just reading, you're also seeing. You know, the medium is the message. How that book looks is as important as what it's saying.
Again, so for example, this sort of shattering of literally of images made itself evident in books?
Sure, yeah. I mean, you pick up any 20th century book, you know it's a 20th century book. They just look fundamentally different than 19th century books.
Right, okay. Okay, so let's move along to Expressionism. Unless you want to say something more about books.
I think we'll probably keep saying things about books.
German Expressionism was characterized by an alienation from bourgeois values and portrayed extremes of emotional experience in dystopic and exuberantly charged manners that represented an inner psychological state. And Expressionists believed art should be shared with all classes. Yes. Anything to add to that?
Well, I think that says it all.
Okay.
We're looking at different kinds of mark making, different uses of color than had formerly occurred. You know, again, it was just a broadening of the available visual languages. There were no more taboos.
Yes, okay. So yes, in fact, here we go with Futurism out of Italy, and the manifestos written by Marinetti. It was devoted to the ideological destruction of government schools, museums, and academic art through confrontation and even war, and blurred visual art with sound, music, theater, design, and architecture, often with the aim of creating a, quote, total work of art. So maybe you could pronounce that German word for me.
Gesamtkunstwerk.
Yeah, nicely done. Yes, okay. And in fact, Wagner tried something similar to this with giant multimedia theater experiences.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, this is related to the arts and crafts ethos of collapsing the boundaries between different art forms. It's actually very much a part of our multimedia environment now. People are expecting this kind of Gesamtkunstwerk approach to stuff. I don't know if you've been following these giant spectacles that they've been making out of Van Gogh and Frida Kahlo lately. I haven't gone to them yet, but here in Toronto during the pandemic, they kind of repurposed Van Gogh, shall we say, into a multimedia screen experience that you drove through in a warehouse.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is exactly where it's coming from. People are hooked on spectacle. And of course, the emergence of the spectacle is happening throughout the modern era from the Renaissance onwards. Well, you could probably even put it before that. But we just keep having a thirst, I would say, for being impressed and overwhelmed in a sensory overload. You know, film has been even trying to do this as well.
Well, that's the other thing too, isn't it? It's like we're talking print here, and in print there's attempts to replicate movement, for example. But then, of course, film comes in and talk about spectacle. That really does capture the attention of all sorts of people, and to some extent, takes them away from the book?
Sure, you could make that argument, yeah. But I mean, I want to go back, though, to the relationship of illustration and theater, which is happening long before this. And, in the early modern period, we can see a lot of the first illustrated books are illustrating stories which were produced on the stage. And the illustrations are like little snapshots of the stage set with the actors coming and going, and they're holding their bodies in typical acting postures so that in the unamplified sound days, you could figure out what was going on if you couldn't hear by decoding the gestures of the actors. And so those gestures are preserved in illustration because it's what people, associated with how you tell a story visually. So there's always been a relationship between illustration and the theater. So this is just kind of coming full circle again.
So interesting, yeah. Again, getting back to that argument about illustration sort of taking away from the imagination. In experiments with books to try and sort of include hyperlinks and such, they haven't been all that successful because there's nothing that replicates this sort of deep, immersive experience of being in a book alone with the words and your imagination. It's your experience too. It's not someone else hasn't made it for you.
Okay, so yes, when you're reading a book, you have to make up a lot of what's going on visually in your head. And the illustrations sort of prompt you in that direction. And we've probably all had the experience of opening a book, reading a bunch, forming an idea of what the characters look like and what's going on. And then you come across an illustration and your heart sinks. You feel sick to your stomach because the illustrator got it wrong.
My heart doesn't sink. My heart doesn't sink. It just says, what a stupid illustrator.
Well, okay. Same thing, I think, that we're talking about. That's
yes,
the same
it is.
Can happen when your favorite book is turned into a movie. Suddenly Dorothy's got black hair instead of the blonde that she was shown to be in the early illustrations. I also want to say we're being a bit dated because of our book affinity, shall we say.
But that's what the show's all about, being dated.
Good. But let us just give a nod to my students who are going to say, because you were mentioning hyperlinks and how, is the multimedia environment really an illustrative one? I think it's kind of what you're asking. They're going to say, okay, boomer, what about video games? Because you're in a completely immersive, illustrated environment. And you are engaging with that environment because you are, to some degree, permitted to control the narrative. So you do have that, that immersive experience.
That's true.
Just a little differently.
That is true, but it's not your environment. Someone else has made it. You're doing the storyline, but you're not making up what everything looks like.
True, but I would say that the experience of moving your avatar through that space is a different way that the reader engages with that text and making it real in their head.
Yeah, it's attempting to get the best of both worlds is what it's doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Definitely, Malum, I would hate video games with a passion because they do build so much for you. And sure, you get to customize your avatar, but you don't get to customize everything else.
I guess it all depends on how good your own imagination is. If you've got a fantastic imagination, then reading's probably really, really enjoyable. If you've got a crappy imagination, maybe not so much.
Well, and it's interesting reading the experiences of people who don't visualize. There are people who don't have that, just neurologically. They kind of feel like they're missing out and they didn't get it for a lot of visual media and books and things. They didn't really see what the big deal was because they didn't understand that for people who visualize in their heads, which is most of us, it is a very engaging experience.
Okay, from that we go to Dada.
Yeah, Dada.
Dada is you referenced the First World War, the most technologically advanced and most horrible war anyone had ever seen the widespread use of mustard gas, airplanes, machine guns, tanks, the abuse of gentlemanly rules of engagement, and the sheer scale of atrocities and number of countries involved seemed apocalyptic.
Am I overstating it?
No,
Yeah.
no, that's and again, I guess it's a reaction to that, just saying, what the fuck? Nothing makes sense. Everything is awful. Nothing makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I often wonder if the futurists and other people who had embraced the idea of war at the beginning, I wonder how much they might have regretted their decision later on.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
You talk about the fact that cheaply produced journals, were really important, obviously. Like print was really important to this whole modernist movement.
Yeah, that's gotten a lot more attention in recent years because now that we have big data and incredibly interesting data visualization projects going on, people have been digitizing these journals and tracing the networks of authors and artists and looking at just how integrated they all were and how collectively they made a movement. That's a turn, I have to say, to paying attention to the ephemeral print media end of modernism. Formerly, back when I was a young undergraduate myself in the 1980s, we were still under the sway of H.W. Jansen, History of Art, and so on, which was hugely dominated by the narrative spun by the Museum of Modern Art. None of those big tomes that I cut my teeth on as a young art history student made any mention of this other aspect of modernism. It was only about paintings and some sculptures.
Yeah, it's funny. You see, they're missing out on the most important aspect of it.
Yeah, that's debatable whether it's the most important, but of course it's bibliophiles, we would say it is.
Well, and I'm pushing ephemera now too, of course. So
yeah, well, it did mean that they could get their message out with text as opposed to walk into an art gallery, be confronted by some painting you don't understand, walk out shaking your head. And that was only accessible to people who are near an art gallery with a modern art show. The journals, like all print, circulate everywhere and have a way of
all around the world.
Yeah.
So very influential.
So in that regard, we could make our argument that this print aspect of modernism was more important than the paintings.
Oh, great. I'm glad you came around to my way of thinking.
I'm just thinking about all my friends who specialize in the actual paintings are going to be upset.
So with Primitivism, there's another movement. You say that the overpowering motif of the era was destruction and reconstruction. And then you get to the forceful color and primitivism of post-impressionists such as Matisse, Gauguin, Van Gogh, and Gauguin particularly. He actually went down to the south.
Well, yeah, he famously resided in Tahiti and is now currently critiqued for his exploitation of Native women. But
of course he is.
Contribution art-wise was
how could he do something like that?
Oh, easy. He was a Frenchman at the turn of the century. That was
exactly
just considered his entitlement at the time. But yes, we should rightfully question that role now. And I'd like to credit some of the artisans and artists of Tahiti whose work he undoubtedly saw, whether it was in architecture or local crafts or clothing. The color isn't probably just coming from the plants he was looking at and the landscape, but also what else in the visual culture was going on there that he was inspired by.
Yeah. I think that's really important to pay tribute to, where they're ripping this off from.
No, for sure. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of scholarship in recent years kind of looking at that. This is a problem with the avant-garde, is that it is so much under the influence of the discourse of genius that had arisen in the Romantic period. Many of these artists were defended or held up as being special visionaries who were geniuses, quote unquote. If their influences were acknowledged at all, it was just seen as, they did, they looked at some stuff, they did some research, they made it better, right? The idea was that whatever they took, they matured, as opposed to looking at mature art forms that they plagiarized.
Right. Okay. Surrealism sought to connect with the unconscious using automatism, spontaneous, intuitive writing or mark making that circumvented censorious rational thought.
Yeah, again, going back to the Romantic period, I mean, Blake was pretty good at this, right? I mean, he had a special communication with God that helped him along the way.
Yes.
So, but I mean, this is the time in the late 19th century when Freud is drawing attention to the idea of the unrational self, the subconscious or unconscious, and its control over us. And people are seeing some sense in that, or perhaps finding some comfort in an explanation for their own troubles or tendencies, because people are questioning the veneer of civilization as it was known. They want to know, well, if you take that away, what have you got? What is natural man? What are we supposed to be? And so this interest in the unconscious is sort of a search for roots, for truth, for an essence to humanity that might be more reliable and authentic.
And we got at that visual. I mean, I think of Dali, of course, but what about books? How does that affect the look of books? I mean, obviously there's the content, but what about the look of books?
Well, I mean, with the rise of the livre d'artiste or artist book, we get people questioning the form of books. So we start seeing things coming out that are not stuck to the traditional Western codex format. So we start to see more accordion books, for instance.
Yeah, okay.
And accordion books are interesting in relation to what we're talking about here because they're continuous from page to page. You don't have that break of flipping the page. So if you want, you can spread out an accordion book and look at it as a panorama or a mural. So you can kind of see a thread going all the way through it if you want.
Well, and physically there isn't that sort of skip.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So constructivism welcomed industrial production as a means of bringing art to the masses. So they embraced photo montage, for example, a combination of photographs, texts, pictures cut out of magazines, newspapers, advertising, and ephemera. The futurists' interest in skyscrapers, movement, space, and time. Anything else on that?
I mean, photomontage is really taking advantage of industrial print production. So instead of turning its back to it the way the more artisanal livre d'artiste did, they embraced it. So this is the art of the garbage can. This is picking up scraps off the sidewalk and using it. This is not throwing your flyers away that come unbidden to the door. This is embracing them and recontextualizing the contents in a very critical and meaningful way.
What was that? But I just picked up a copy of it. Well, it's the MIT reprint of Deutschland über
Alice.
Yes, that was the late 20s, wasn't it?
Not sure. I'd have to Google that, but obviously it's tied to sort of German nationalism.
It is, but it's also very much tied to this whole idea of what you've just talked about, this the montage. I mean, the whole book is like that, with putting these images in different contexts and poking fun at things. And
you see that sensibility with John Heartfield, right? Who's using this in a satirical sense to ridicule Hitler and other problems with society at the time in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, that's such a striking. I mean, I've always been really blown away by that image of Hitler with his sort of lungs, kind of like an X-ray of his lungs showing. It's such a powerful, striking image, I think.
Yeah, and at the time, not easy to put together in such a seamless way.
Right.
Actually quite highly crafted.
And this great thing of swallowing gold and spitting out tin.
I've always felt that the spitting or spouting was a polite translation and the real sense is vomiting.
Yes. I'm glad we mentioned Heartfield.
Yeah, I wish we had Hannah Hoch in here too, but we do not. But just to give a nod to a feminist use of photomontage.
And what's that?
Well, Hannah Hoch was a woman associated with the Dada movement who approached issues of gender in her photomontage work. So
Back in when, when?
same period.
Same period, okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so finally, let's look at Bauhaus. So in 1919, a radical new German art school, the Staliches Bauhaus, was established. Art for art's sake was rejected in favor of art for the common good.
We're back to the arts and crafts movement.
Yes, okay. Build an orderly, enlightened way of living by unifying fine art and craft under the rubric of architecture. New class leveling order, simple shapes. Proponents embraced the functionality of advertising, manifesting a preference for typography and design over image. Just read a bit more here. The dictum less is more, the idea that the reduction of elements would amplify and clarify the message. Their books are characterized by sans serif type, untraditional but logically planned layouts, activation of white space as compositional element rather than simply a neutral background, geometric shapes and grid layouts to rationalize and standardize visual communication. Photography made the most suitable kind of illustration because it was an industrial technology matching photomechanical printing and automated typesetting. Like the Dadaists, Futurists, and Constructivists, they exploited photo montage.
Right. So the experts in this field will be going, but. So just a reminder, this is an undergraduate textbook that is meant to give students kind of the broad outlines of things and generalize a little bit. They'll provoke advanced inquiry. So that is somewhat a reduction of what Bauhaus stood for, of course. But definitely international style then becomes a dominant look, shall we say, in graphic design in North America and Europe. Depending on the art director or what was being done, illustration was often very secondary concern.
Yeah, and then they got rid of ornamentation such as head and tail pieces, borders, and decorated initials. So it was clean, I guess.
That was the word. Yes, other people would say it was boring.
Right. Okay, so finally here in your conclusion, you say, furthermore, when avant-garde art was successfully applied to books, magazines, goods, or advertising, it seemed to result in more distance between rich and poor, not less, as many had wished. So big question mark beside that.
Question mark in what way?
I don't understand how that happened.
Well, if you look at the image for Suprematism, which we skipped over, page 315.
Okay.
So do you see this image? You've got a big square that is the border around the illustration. First of all, just a black key line. Inside that square, we have a red square tilted a little bit on an angle.
Yes, that's Liszewski, right?
Yes, a whole bunch of little rectangles in black and white, gray, etc. Accessible or not accessible?
Don't understand.
Right. This is a children's book illustration.
Oh, you're kidding.
Nope. So this is the kind of effort that was made to level the playing field, as it were. It was supposed to remove barriers to all classes to be able to enjoy illustrated books and improve their literacy. This is a children's book which is coaching communist ideals. Of course, it's also going, as all children's books do, trying to teach children how to read. But the image itself is pretty impenetrable. It's fully abstract. So it then requires someone to explain what the point is, what the red square represents, what the black pieces represent. You end up having to talk a lot. And at the end of the day, it's mildly curious, but quickly a page turner for children, I think in particular, and for a lot of adults. So to appreciate this and all of its intent, all of its moral high ground, etc., that required an education. It required someone in the know. So this was the problem with so many of these modernist art forms, is that they departed so much from the normal, which is to say industrial mass media way of portraying the world or representing reality, that it just lost its audience, or the audience it was going after. And it became something accessible only to people who had the patience and the interest to learn about it. So Cubism, in my lifetime, I met adults older than me as a child. I remember this, a mother of a friend of mine who felt that all modern artists were just crazy people and that stuff was garbage. My kid could do that, etc. So it did not have the intended effect, which was to be accessible and inclusive of everybody.
In an odd way, that's the problem with William Morris too. It's like he produced these beautiful books, but only the rich could afford them.
Yep. To his credit, he didn't intend for that. He said he wanted everybody to have access to the beautiful books, not just the rich. Famously, he mistreated his own books badly, leave them out in the rain and so on. So there we have the gap between the ideal and what actually happens.
You got to reach for the stars.
Yeah, you have to have a goal, and whether you get to the goal or not can sometimes be irrelevant. The main point is that you tried and that you resisted backsliding into complete evil.
Okay, I just want to read out a couple because it really is a well-written piece, I must say.
Thank you.
Paradoxically, however, even the most controversial art for art's sake paintings and sculptures were arguably being turned into entertaining commodities avidly collected by the bourgeoisie. Avant-garde artists who wished to survive by their art alone had to cultivate art dealers and collectors, throwing their supposedly non-commercial freedom into question. And finally, historians and dealers gradually diminished the history of how integral illustration and publishing had once been to avant-garde art, to the point that fine artists' illustration careers began to be eliminated from biographies or framed as a side interest or necessary evil to fund the artist's real work. That's such an important point.
Yeah, this is the kind of sad outcome of all this for the illustration industries and illustrators' lives. The illustrators who came of age between the 50s and the 90s, I'll say, have really had to struggle with their artistic identity. And you will find many of them say, well, I'm not an artist.
Well, because I'm getting paid to flog stuff.
Because they were told their whole lives they weren't artists. And they also didn't like the posturing of genius artists who pretended not to care about the market, but in fact were quite anxious to get really good gallery representation. and they kind of saw through a lot of the marketing BS that happens in the art world. And they didn't want to be identified with that and be sort of dismissed as one of those kinds of artists or someone whose work was not understood by the public. So there were lots of reasons to disavow the art identity, but that really wasn't doing a favor to the reception of illustration as a whole. It sort of put fuel into the those who were trying to dismiss illustration as a form of art. So, art can be a very broad category. There's many different kinds, and I've never particularly liked the hierarchies that we've been handed as a result of this discourse of modernism that was going on. In this chapter, you may have noticed there's a one page, 319, which discusses Clement Greenberg's famous essay, Avant Garde and Kitsch. And that lays out the parameters of this debate quite thoroughly. And Greenberg needs to shoulder a lot of the responsibility for both expressing and perpetuating this attitude of art versus illustration instead of art including illustration.
Again, I'm not going to get into it deeply, but is it the fact that there was an ulterior motive? The illustrators were basically just, certainly in the case of advertisers, just trying to get people to buy stuff. Was that a part of the problem?
Certainly many illustrators were hired to get people to buy stuff. Interestingly, if you roll back to about 1900, the term commercial art only referred to illustrators working in advertising. That was commercial art. As the 20th century rolls along, by about the 50s or 60s, the term commercial art was referring to all illustrators, including those of books and magazines and stories and so on. It still managed, of course, to not include those who were illustrating livres d'artiste. That was where the line was drawn. But those who illustrated trade books were also getting called commercial artists by that point.
Isn't it fascinating how, libraries and institutions, they don't care about the ephemera, they throw that all out. But
yeah, they're starting to realize the mistake now, but the damage is done.
Yeah. Well, it's gone because they've thrown them in dumpsters.
It's the definition of ephemera. Yeah. So ironically, a lot of the things that carry illustration, which are periodicals and posters and so forth, they're far more rare than what gets called rare books these days. And we can see divisions in libraries where they keep the things that did get saved, the livres d'artiste, for instance, and anything to do with arts and crafts production or William Morris ideals. They're carefully under lock and key and display cabinets and treasured and get the conservation dollars spent on them and loaned out to exhibitions and blah, blah, blah. But try and get the same kind of respect, even for original illustration art. I'm not talking the books and magazine, but the actual original art, molders, quite literally. There are famous institutions that I hesitate to name because I don't want to embarrass them, but I know that were gifted large collections of illustration art decades and decades ago, but because it had no cultural capital, they stuck it in the attic, they stuck it in the basement, they stuck it where it was out of the way, but unfortunately also prey to insects, flood, fire, smoke, dirt. I mean, we've lost so much just from poor care.
Yeah, this ephemera, you talk about cultural capital. This actually had an impact on society. It got out and a ton of people consumed it compared to the other stuff. And so it really has way more cultural capital.
So cultural capital
if
is,
you want to call it that way. I know what you're saying.
I would say cultural influence. Cultural capital implies some prestige.
Well, it does, and also decisions made by so-called authorities.
Well, the influence cannot be denied, and that is partly why it was denigrated for so long, because cultural critics have been very cautious, nervous about the effects of mass media for good reason. They didn't really want to look at it in a positive way because they were interested in critiquing the problems of mass communication. So, Marshall McLuhan's early work is all about the dangers of mass media and the imagery contained in it. So, yeah, not only was it considered garbage, it was dangerous garbage.
That's right. Subliminal.
Not so subliminal sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And yet people were consuming it. So I think as scholars, we definitely have a responsibility to account for it. And we have an incomplete picture of society and our lives and ourselves if we don't account for it.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to air this because I don't want a bunch of people running after the same ephemera that I'm trying to find.
Well, that's a problem, isn't it? Of course, if you haven't named the exact ephemera you're after, one of the advantages, if you're thinking about it as a collector, is that stop publishing this stuff because it's rarefied knowledge now to know what are the obscure titles these days. I will name one because it's what I'm currently working on right now. This magazine, which actually was kind of prominent back in the 30s and 40s, has since nearly completely disappeared, and it was called Magazine Digest. You could actually still readily buy them on eBay and so on. There's enough floating around. But in Canada, well, in Ontario, there's only 2 university libraries that have any of them. Neither has a complete run. That's it. And nobody has written about it. That's why I'm doing it now.
Well, isn't that the great thing about what you're doing and what collectors do, collector scholars do, making sure we don't forget about really interesting stuff, and for the obvious reasons.
Yeah, well, this is the purpose of being a historian, really, is believing that the past does actually matter, and that, well, we like to think we can learn from it, although I'm not sure that we do for practice.
No, we don't.
But I mean, this is why we're doing truth and reconciliation in Canada too. If history didn't matter, we wouldn't bother with things like that. but understanding how messages get out, how they're understood, how public opinion is formed, we need to study mass media to understand those things.
And books are sort of like mass media, except a little bit higher brow.
Well, some books were very mass. The ones we've been mostly talking about today are not. But because they were cherished, precious objects, they've hung around and they continue to get looked at and admired. So they continue to have influence in the present day in their original form. Whereas the more ephemeral things, they continue to have influence in the present day through their descendants. So we study them for slightly different reasons.
Well, what a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Jaleen.
Well, thank you, Nigel. I'm really glad that you run this show, especially as we see bookshops disappear.
Very good. I've been talking with, let me get this right here.
What's my name again?
No, it's Jaleen Grove. Well, why don't you just do the extra? How's that? I've been talking to
Jaleen Grove,
who
is an assistant professor in illustration at the Rhode Island School of Design and a historian of Canadian and American visual culture and illustration.
Thank you so much for your time again.
Thank you.